I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent work that I've done on spinning up different components of Earth system models. And I don't really need to give too much of an introduction to this problem, but it's, the so-called spin-up problem is one in which how can we efficiently calculate equilibrium solutions of complex climate models. And these equilibrium solutions are necessary in order for us to do things like climate change assessments, for instance. So it's a problem because the equilibration time of many components of the Earth system is extremely long, many thousands to tens of thousands of years, primarily because of the deep ocean and the terrestrial carbon cycle. A single spin up in a typical ESM can take many, many months, several months to almost a year or two of compute time. And as an example, I'm showing you the ocean and land from two different models. The details don't matter. On the left-hand side is the air-sea flux of CO2 in an ocean model being spun up to equilibrium. And you can see that it takes about 3,000 to 4,000 years to get to some kind of acceptable level of air-sea CO2 flux. Okay? So you want to minimize this quantity in this case. On the right-hand side is an example of a terrestrial carbon cycle model. This is Joules. That's the land model in UK ESM. And you can see the time scale on that is very different. It's goes up to about 90,000 years. And you can see that in many regions of the planet, especially cold regions, it can take extremely long for the carbon cycle to come into some kind of equilibrium because the reaction rates are so slow that it really takes that long to get to equilibrium. And not surprisingly, in CMEP, for instance, people use many different types of spin-up timescales, ranging from a few hundred years to over 11,000 years in some instances. So there's a huge variety of timescales being used to spin up these models, and that can obviously, makes it difficult to compare different models. For instance, okay. So I'm going to jump into the main part of my talk. I'm going to keep this relatively short. I'll take questions at the end, or please interrupt at any point. So you can think about spin up by direct time integration, which is what we do conventionally, as mathematically being some kind of fixed point iteration scheme, where you start with some initial state of your model. I'm going to call it x0. You plug it into your model, which I'm going to call symbolically by this function g, and you integrate it for one forcing cycle, which typically is about a year, let's say, the seasonal cycle, and you get a new solution out. After 1 year, you plug that back into the right-hand side, and you keep repeating this until the left-hand side becomes equal to the right-hand side, or as close as you can make the two be. Okay, that's what conventional spin-up is about. You basically just keep repeating this fixed point iteration. And then the question is, can we do better than this? And this is where sequence acceleration methods come in. So direct time integration essentially generates a sequence of solutions. I'm going to call that by this set xk over here, which converges very slowly. So you can think of it, you're familiar with sequences, power series, etc. This is just a more complicated type of sequence, and one that converges slowly. So the idea behind sequence acceleration is to sort of transform one slowly converging sequence into another sequence that hopefully converges relatively quickly, or at least more quickly. Okay, and there are examples that go all the way back to Euler. He was probably the first one to introduce this idea, where a simple rearrangement of a power series can give you faster convergence, basically. In our own field, in numerical methods, Richardson extrapolation is a more recent example. It's fairly well known in scientific computing. And so you can sort of take this idea further for vector sequences, which is essentially what a model is generating. And one of the simplest ideas is what's called simple mixing, where you essentially take a linear combination of two previous iterates. And it turns out that depending on that linear combination, which is controlled by this parameter beta, it's called the damping parameter, you can actually get a new sequence that converges slightly faster. Okay, so this is just a very simple example of how you can apply sequence acceleration to whatever model that you're dealing with over here, or whatever the problem is. So the one that I'm going to be using is due to D.G. Anderson, who essentially came up with this really elegant scheme that takes not two previous iterates like in the example before, but it takes mk previous iterates. So basically, this is called the history of the method. So you essentially retain previous iterates, and you take a linear combination of them such that the residual, this difference here at any given iteration, is minimized. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind Anderson acceleration. So you can think of it as some kind of extrapolation method, where you essentially take a combination of previous iterates and you extrapolate to an iterate that is closer to the final solution than you would otherwise expect it to be based on the original sequence, essentially. Okay, the way you calculate these coefficients over here, these alphas, is by solving a simple least squares problem, okay, subject to the normalization that the alphas must add up to 1, okay, which is really important for what we want to do, is because if you're trying to conserve tracer in your model, right, that's essentially this normalization here will automatically impose that conservation on your iterates, essentially. Okay, and that's the basic idea behind Anderson acceleration. It turns out that this solution is exact if your model is linear. Obviously, your model is not linear, so this is only an approximate solution that you obtained, but one that is closer to equilibrium in our case than the original sequence that you had. Okay. One of the advantages of sequence acceleration is you don't touch your model. Okay, that's, you have a black box model that is spitting out these iterates. Okay, what you do is you modify the sequence rather than the model itself. Okay, so that sort of distinguishes this approach from things like Newton-Krylov, which have been used in other contexts, in marine biogeochemistry, for instance. Okay. Okay, so a little bit about the practical details. The implementation and workflow, it's relatively simple. The Anderson acceleration code is written in Python. It basically sits as a wrapper. So essentially it wraps around your model, okay, and the wrapper handles the calls to your model, basically. Okay, so essentially what you're doing at every iterate is you're producing a solution, you're feeding it into the model as an initial condition. The model does its time stepping, gives you a new solution that you feed back into Anderson, which then produces a new iterate, and it feeds that back into the model. Okay, that's the basic idea behind this simple workflow. In ocean models, and I'll show you some examples, we're essentially running one instance of Anderson, this AA algorithm, okay, and that instance is being applied to the entire model. Okay, for land model, for terrestrial carbon cycle model, because of how they're configured, as essentially a sequence of one-dimensional columns. Okay, so land models are basically then like, ocean models. There is no circulation, right? It's just one-dimensional independent columns of soil. So you can treat each of them independently, and so you're running one instance of AA on every single column that you've got. Okay, and you can run thousands of instances of Anderson because it's so lightweight. Okay, as shown by this little snippet of Python code. This is basically what we use to run Anderson on Joules, for instance. Okay, so we're running thousands of instances of Anderson on a single instance of Joules that is running like it typically does. Okay, and you're spinning up individual columns independently of each other. The implementation allows for checkpointing and restarts because you want to run these on big supercomputers. That's kind of necessary. The Anderson acceleration algorithm itself has extremely low overhead. Okay, so the main overhead in Anderson comes from the fact that you have to store some number of previous iterates. Okay, and that can get quite expensive in terms of memory, but in terms of the actual operations being performed by Anderson, which is solving a simple least squares problem, it's extremely low overhead relative to running your actual model. Okay, so it can take typically, a few seconds to maybe a minute to generate a new iterate. And of course, then your model runs for the next 30 minutes for a year. Okay, so relative to that, it's a very low overhead. There are two algorithm parameters in Anderson. There's not much you can control here. One is this damping parameter that I mentioned before, beta. And then the other is this maximum memory that you want to retain, basically. That's the history of the Anderson method, essentially. It turns out from experience that about 50 works quite well for ocean models and about 15 for land models. That's kind of been my experience. This can actually vary in time if you like, and beta can vary as well if you like. In most cases, I use a damping parameter of 1, which is the full Anderson acceleration. Okay, a beta of 0 will give you the original direct time integration, basically. So you can kind of switch back and forth between the two or have, some combination of the two going on at the same time. Okay, termination is based on either the residual going below some limit, or you can essentially have an external criteria, like the CO2 flux, for instance, going below some threshold. Okay, and you can then signal the method to say, okay, we've reached termination now. And then finally, in a lot of problems, the convergence to steady state is essentially controlled by very slowly evolving tracers. Okay, so for instance, in the ocean, you've got the deep ocean nutrients, that evolve extremely slowly, or carbon that evolves extremely slowly over time. On the other hand, you've got some very fast tracers like phytoplankton at the surface of the ocean that equilibrate very quickly. Okay, so it's convenient to actually split the problem into fast and slow components based on whatever criteria you have. And then you apply Anderson only to the slow components, which you're completely free to pick in any way you want. So example, deep ocean nutrients. But you also apply the same extrapolation coefficients to the entire model at the same time because you want to conserve tracer. Okay, if you don't do that, you violate tracer conservation potentially, which obviously is important in a lot of our problems. Okay, so I'll give some examples. My first example is the Piscis marine biogeochemical model that's coupled to NEMO. You're probably familiar with NEMO and Piscis. NEMO has 24 prognostic tracers. In these experiments, I'm using the ORCA2 grid, sort of the fastest one that I could find that I could run. And I'm keeping a history parameter of about 50 over here. Okay? So it's a sizable problem. Essentially what we're doing is we're spinning up about 30 million variables simultaneously, if you can think about it mathematically. Basically, that's the size of your X vector essentially in this particular configuration that you've got. Okay. So the first thing here is I'm just going to show you a selected few tracers. There's 24. There's no need to see all of them. So this is the tracer diff. So this is the residual, the norm of the residual, okay, on a log scale. And this is the integration time in years. The blue line is direct time integration. And the red one is the Anderson accelerated solution. And you can see in all cases, the Anderson one converges much more quickly than the direct time integration over here. Okay. This is DIC, this is alkalinity, oxygen, and so on and so forth. Okay. And this last one here is nitrate, the nutrient, which tends to take quite a bit longer. Oops. Right. A more physical criterion for equilibrium is the air-sea flux of CO2. So in OMEP, which is part of CMEP, a criterion was established that the air-sea flux of CO2 should be below 0.01 petagrams carbon per year. We don't want any drift. We don't want any net CO2 being coming in or out of the ocean, basically, right, in equilibrium. That's the basic idea. And again, you see that relative to direct time integration, which is the blue line here, the Anderson solution converges much more quickly, about 12 times faster in this particular case. Okay, so that's quite a significant speed up. And then finally, just to confirm, okay, there's pointwise convergence of the Anderson solution. Okay, so this is the Anderson solution on the y-axis. at 350 years versus the direct time integration solution at 5,000 years. Okay, and for the same 6 tracers that I showed before. And this is shown at every single grid point in the model. So this is a pointwise comparison. Okay, an exact match would be on a 1-to-1 line, like you find here. And yes, in this case, we essentially get everywhere, we get that 1-to-1 match. Okay, so about 350 years of time integration with Anderson will get you the same solution as maybe 3,000 year or 4,000 year solution with direct time integration in this case. Okay. As you know, in CMIP, models are not spun up with a purely seasonal cycle, but they have interannual variability in it. So this is an example from UKESM, from Andrew Yule's paper, showing their spin up. So this is, again, the air-sea flux of CO2. And what they did in UKESM in CMIP 6 is they forced the model with a 30-year repeat cycle of atmospheric forcing from the atmospheric model. And that was what was used for the ocean spin up, basically. And the dark blue line here is the 30-year moving average. And then the shaded region is the minimum and the maximum over a 30-year moving window, basically. So you can see there are enormous fluctuations in just this particular quantity that you see over here. And any method for spin up would struggle with these kinds of fluctuations. Certainly, if you applied Anderson to a model that was being forced in this way, it would be extremely hard for it to get to equilibrium, basically. Okay. What I've done instead, and this is an experiment that I've done with MIT GCM coupled to the Blink biogeochemistry model, is I've used Anderson to generate an initial condition, okay, using essentially 1 year of the forcing. Okay, so it's not a different configuration of the model. It's just it's the exact same configuration of the model, but it's just being forced with a repeated 1 year forcing period, basically. Okay, and so I applied 200 iterations of Anderson to generate an initial condition, and then I inject that initial condition for the biogeochemistry into the freely running model with the full time variability. In this case, it's a 50-year repeat cycle of core 2 forcing. Okay, so if I were to compare this with the direct time integration, right, that's shown in the blue over here, and then the fact that we've got a much better initial condition with Anderson means that we can get to an equilibrium quite a bit more quickly, about roughly 5 times faster in this case. Okay, so even with time varying forcing, you might be able to exploit Anderson to get to an equilibrium state much more quickly than you would otherwise be able to get. Okay, in this case, just by using a better initial condition, essentially. And then I'll switch to the land. I've got one example to show you from the Joules land surface model, which is used in UKESM. Okay, so this is an example where it was actually quite beneficial to apply Anderson only to the slowly evolving biogeochemical components. Okay, so in Joules, for instance, in this particular case, we're essentially applying Anderson just to the soil carbon and nitrogen. Okay, and then everything else is allowed to freely evolve, essentially, and also nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen, to conserve tracer. Okay, and what you see on the left-hand side is are the fast tracers. This is inorganic nitrogen, and this is the slowly evolving tracer. This is soil nitrogen stock, basically. Okay, and this is in a particular vertical column. Okay, and you can see that the direct time integration is going to take 40 to 50,000 years to get to some kind of equilibrium, whereas with Anderson, we can get to that within about 500 iterations or so. Okay, so depending on where you are at the surface of the planet, Anderson is between 30 and 10 to 30 times faster in this case. Okay, and it's quite easy to set up this kind of workflow with the code. So this is the actual complete code that we use to have this type of iterative method, where you essentially spin up the slow biogeochemistry, and then we interleave that with a freely evolving run of the model. Okay, so we just go back and forth between the two, okay, to allow the physical model to sort of catch up, essentially, with the biogeochemistry. Okay, and then the last thing I want to talk about is, can we use Anderson acceleration or some other sequence acceleration for spinning up ocean dynamical models. Okay, so this is in some ways, I think, a much harder problem than ocean biogeochemistry or even terrestrial biogeochemistry, even though they're extremely nonlinear problems. Okay. My preliminary kind of work on this suggests that if you apply Anderson, straightforwardly to the complete model, it doesn't work really well. Okay, because Anderson can produce iterates that the model doesn't like. It's going to just blow up essentially. Okay, so that turns out not to work so well. But on the other hand, we know that Anderson works really well on tracers. Okay, certainly it works extremely well on passive tracers. So why can it not work on temperature and salinity? So what I've done is, in very preliminary work, I've come up with this iterative spin-up scheme where I have what I call passive TNS. So passive TNS is essentially TNS that is advected and diffused passively. Okay, so it's not an active tracer like the dynamical tracers TNS, but they're subject to the exact same forcing as the real TNS in the model. Okay, so the passive TNS see exactly the same forcing and circulation as the real TNS, but they don't feed back on the circulation like real TNS do. Okay, that's what I mean by passive TNS. Okay, so what I have is an iterative scheme where I spin up the passive TNS using Anderson for a given fixed flow field. Okay, then I replace the real TNS with the passive TNS because that's sort of in equilibrium or close to equilibrium. We don't need to run it completely to equilibrium. And then you let the model run freely, essentially to allow the flow field to adjust dynamically, geostrophically to the new TNS that you've put in. Okay, and then you can repeat this iteration a few times and see what happens. Okay, and again, it's quite easy to set this up. This is, again, the complete code in Python for setting up this workflow. It's very straightforward. And here are some examples from MIT GCM. So this is the LLC 90 configuration. This is the lat-long cap configuration, which is nominally about 1 degree. I think it has 50 vertical layers. And this is forced with core to normal year forcing, basically. Okay. And so in blue here is the direct time integration. And what I'm showing you here, this is as far as I've run the model, is the RMS difference between the solution, in this case, temperature, let's say, and the solution at 3,200 years. Okay, so this is the direct time integration solution. So you start up high, and then you slowly go down. This is salinity, zonal velocity, and meridional velocity. Okay, and this is the same thing with Anderson over here. Okay, so what I've done in this case is I'm applying, if I go back to this, I'm essentially doing 50 iterations of this spin up, okay, passive TNS spin up. Okay, and then I replace the real TS with that, and then I let the model run for another 50 years to dynamically adjust, and then I repeat that whole thing. Okay, so I've repeated about 3 or 4 times in this case. Okay, and this is what you find. And so preliminary results suggest that, well, it's fairly promising. You can get to convergence much more quickly, assuming you define this to be your convergence. The RMS difference between your solution and the final solution. There are probably other ways in which you can quantify drift, which I haven't done yet, but I think it would probably give a similar story. So it seems fairly effective in getting to equilibrium, even on the ocean physics. My experience suggests that the closer you are to your final solution, okay, so for instance, in this particular case, in this experiment, I started with a solution that was only 50 years of direct time integration. So I started fairly low, very high in terms of the RMS difference. Okay, but I think if you had a solution after, say, 1,000 years, and you started from there, you would get to convergence much more quickly. Okay, so the closer you are to convergence, I think you can essentially get this long tail to equilibrate much more quickly, the closer you are to convergence, basically. Okay, so there is some advantage to starting closer there. Okay, so if you have a solution, if you run your model for 1,000 years, okay, you can then apply Anderson in the way that I've just described, and you can probably short circuit the next 3,000 years of your spin up quite substantially by using this type of approach. Okay, so just a quick summary. So what I've demonstrated is that you can use Anderson acceleration to speed up the spin up of fairly complex marine and terrestrial biogeochemical models. Depending on the model and situation, you can get somewhere between a factor of 5 to 30 speed up. The method is completely black box. Okay, it treats your model as a complete black box. You give it an input, it gets an output, and that's essentially basic workflow. Has negligible overhead. Conservation properties, if you have any in your model, like biogeochemical models do, they're automatically satisfied because you're always taking linear combinations of previous solutions from the model. My experience suggests that the performance doesn't depend too much on model resolution, but then I've never pushed model resolution beyond about a nominal 1 degree. So I'm not entirely sure how this would behave if you had eddies, for instance. It's a very scalable, lightweight implementation, and it's been demonstrated to work on a whole bunch of different models: Nemo Medusa, Nemo Piscis, Hammock, as implemented in NOR-ESM, MIT GCM, and so on and so forth. And like I've just suggested, there is potential to use Anderson on other components, for instance, ocean physics, but also sea ice models and ice sheet models. Okay, and you can read more in a couple of recent papers, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from the audience? I'll ask one. So you showed the results with joules, and you rightly pointed out that normally joules is run as a number of columns, which are all independent from one another. Have you seen anyone then try and apply any of these spun up states from joules to starting a GCM simulation and then seeing how that reacts?
No, we haven't done that yet. This is still fairly, I wouldn't say preliminary. We're now actually applying joules. We're applying this approach to a more global configuration of joules. So I think the first step is to actually get that equilibrated, and then we can actually do exactly what you suggested. So yes, that's sort of the next step in this.
And there is a bit, so you were talking about doing the biogeochemistry in the model, but then you were saying if you try to do it on the full model, the system might not react very well. And in joules equally, yeah, you have these pesky nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle components, which have very long equilibration rates. But equally, you also have the water and heat and all that. And some of these things are connected. Might there be a similar problem in that when you try to do the full physics, it will also not react very well?
Absolutely. So we don't actually apply Anderson to the full physics. What we found is that you're right. Actually, temperature in the soil, the deep temperature in the soil, also takes extremely long to reach equilibrium, especially in cold regions. So all of these issues are particularly in cold regions where temperatures are very low and reaction rates extremely low. And so those are the places where you want to get to equilibrium much more quickly. And so what I've done in some workflows is, again, it's easy to kind of have a workflow where you can spin up different components as you want. And it's actually quite useful to first spin up the temperature in the soil, independently of anything else, the temperature and the humidity. And then you can start applying Anderson to the biogeochemistry. And so that really helps quite a bit. So you can sort of iterate back and forth between the two. But in all, within about, at most, I think about 1,500 years, the whole model is in equilibrium, as far as we can tell, as opposed to the 80 or 90,000 years you might otherwise require at some points.
I think Jeff had a question.
So you don't need to do this on tracers, do you? Because obviously temperature and salinity in the ocean aren't tracers, because the temperature moves along isopycnals. And so does it mean it's going to spin up differently if it's not absolutely acting as a tracer?
Not sure I understand. I mean, TNS are, as far as I know, they're tracer fields in the model. They are vectored and diffused like any other tracers. The only difference being that they feed back on the physics. But they are tracers in every other respect. Not entirely sure.
But temperature and salinity don't follow the same tracer pathways necessarily, and so if the density is what comes out of temperature and salinity, and so then they might move along the density pathways.
Sorry, I'm not really understanding the question. You can apply, I mean, you can still apply this to, Anderson doesn't know anything about your model. It doesn't know that these are temperature and salinities. It's treating it as a black box system, which is a system of equations. And it's essentially trying to get to an equilibrium solution of some kind. So I'm not entirely sure what the question here is, because you can it certainly works really well on spinning up TNS for a given flow field. So I'm not entirely sure why you wouldn't be able to do this.
But the ocean is density structured, and
It doesn't matter.
So,
I mean,
so if you have them both behave like tracers, then they might not actually be stable.
But they are tracers. They're simulated as tracers. The ocean, the numerical code in the model treats them as tracers. So I'm not quite sure why you wouldn't think of them as such. They are subject to advection diffusion, aren't they?
But not independently.
It doesn't matter. That's perfectly fine. I'm not sure what the issue here is.
Yeah, never mind.
Yep.
Okay. Do we have other questions? Okay, I don't see any more questions. I think maybe the science steering group we'll need to come back to you with more specific questions to see if we can identify some immediate actions based on what you have already done, particularly on the physical side of ocean models, which is what we are trying to do. Anyway, with all that, thank you. And before we disconnect, I wanted to remind people that on the 16th of September, we'll have another Science Hour, and Mario Costa has agreed to talk about their work on researching how much energy has been used in the previous CMIP exercise, and then all the work that is happening in Primavera with all sorts of methods to reduce our footprint, and seeing where we are with measuring all that, and making sure that throughout the next years of ERIE, we can document all we're doing, and eventually we come out with a similar report that was done for CMIP 6. And we can quantify how much of a difference we made, given what we initially promised we would do. So I look forward to seeing you all back in mid-September. Okay, with that,
Thank you.
say goodbye. Have a nice afternoon.